Welcome everybody to the EnSafe EHS Educational Webinar Series. This is our fourth session in 4 weeks. Thank you for joining us today. Our topic today is TSCA and the chemical data reporting requirements associated with TSCA. Our presentation today is going to be given by Adam Weissman and Tiffany Thomas. Adam is a chemical engineer with EnSafe. He does quite a bit of environmental compliance work. Prior to working at EnSafe, he worked in the aerospace and mining industries. And Tiffany Thomas has a doctorate in chemistry. She's our chief chemist here at EnSafe. She's been with us for 5 years, and her specialties include emerging contaminants and forensic chemistry. At the end of the presentation, we'll answer all the questions at that time. And by the way, I know some of you have attended some of our previous webinars, or maybe just a couple of them. All of our previous webinars are now viewable on our website. So I'll send you to the link to that when this is over. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Adam.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Appreciate folks joining in, and appreciate the opportunity to speak to you this morning. We're going to be talking about the Toxic Substance Control Act chemical data reporting requirements, and go through those materials. So I have put together an agenda for the presentation, and I really want to welcome everyone here to the fourth in our eight session series, and I think I have a big act to follow with Leo and Joe Hoffman last week. This is the first of the environmental subjects that we're presenting, and next week will be a regulatory update. The chemical data reporting cycle is now active, and I'm going to get into that obviously. And really, I think my intention this morning is to give you what I hope is a bigger versus a smaller picture, and give you a feel for the chemical data reporting requirements. And hopefully, I think at the end of the session, you'll be more comfortable with the chemical data reporting, and basically, hopefully, be able to answer some of the questions that I put up on the screen regarding, again, some of the basic elements. Does this report pertain to you and your facility? So, again, who is needing to even file this report, and how would you do your research to determine whether you do need to file? I think that's a key element. What kind of data gets reported? What are the reporting deadlines? I think what I'm not going to be doing this morning, and nor is it my intention, I'm not going to give a blow-by-blow, screenshot-by-screenshot description of how to actually file a chemical data report. There's some excellent tools that we're going to share at the end of the session, and the EPA tools are actually pretty good regarding the actual login and process. And Leo, I guess one of the things I had mentioned was if folks respond back with their chat feature, I guess I'm putting a question out to the room, and I prefer the answer to be very simple, yes, no, and then maybe a 0 to 5 rating. So the yes, no portion is, has anyone ever reported or filed a chemical data report, which is also called a Form U? So has anyone ever filed one of these reports of the folks on the call today in the webinar? And then maybe rating your TSCA experience, a 0 to 5, 0 being you basically feel like you have very weak or no TSCA experience, and 5 being quite knowledgeable. So just it'd be interesting, I think, to see how many folks have ever done one of these. So I appreciate that. And Leo can maybe fill me in on some of the responses that we have coming in on that question. So a little background, and of course, this is appropriate with this subject matter. The Toxic Substances Control Act goes back to the 1970s, primarily designed to regulate chemicals, both while in and ideally even before they enter the commercial marketplace. It really allowed the EPA to restrict certain chemicals that would be viewed as posing an unreasonable risk to human health or the environment. The typical traditional focus of the TSCA program has been, obviously, folks have heard about the focus on PCBs, but asbestos, radon, and lead. There were reforms in 2016, Frank Lautenberg Act. There was additional reforms, or I should say an update in the 17-18 time frame. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. The active versus inactive rule, and the reach out to the regulated community to let the EPA know whether a chemical was either active or inactive. I'll talk about that a little bit more. And another thing that I'll mention a few times is that it generally excludes certain categories altogether, things like food, drugs, cosmetics, and pesticides. There are a few others, but those are generally excluded from the TSCA program. One of the things that folks always seem to focus on and talk about is the chemical inventory, the list, the TSCA list. You'll hear folks say, "Gee, is my chemical on the list?" This was created in the 1970s, 86,000 chemicals. Let me just get a list of chemicals in the commercial marketplace. You can think of it as chemicals in commerce, chemicals that are in our market space, chemicals which would therefore be expected to expose workers or the public, the workers at the plant, obviously, producing and working with the chemicals, the public who are consuming and using the chemicals. Again, I'm going to talk about the active versus inactive, but there are over 41,000 active chemicals, and these are chemicals that the regulated community, the users, have let the EPA know that are active, meaning that they're currently in use, they've been used within a 10-year period. And this was a big thing, to refresh this list and make sure that it was accurate and didn't contain, well, it can contain inactive, but the idea was to refresh the list and bring up to current which chemicals are active versus which are inactive. This chemical data reporting cycle or report, it serves to provide a database of the chemicals being manufactured or imported into the United States. And I'm going to mention this a few times, but in TSCA, manufacture and importation of use is the same. There are some similarities with the toxic release inventory control TRI process, which I'm sure folks on the webinar this morning are very involved with. I'm doing quite a few TRI reports. As we all know, they do July 1st. The CDR is not due July 1st. So there are some similarities with the TRI process, but a fundamental difference is that TRI focuses on releases to the environment. So where did a chemical go in the environment? Did it go to air? Did it go to water? Did it go to a landfill? That is not the purpose of the CDR report. The CDR is also focused on the chemicals which are on the TSCA inventory. And there's also a link there to a short piece that was on our website regarding this. I think one other thing I'll say here is that this report is an odd man out. And what I mean by that is this is a report that is done on a 4-year cycle. And I think as a result, folks have less comfort and familiarity with it. There is no outreach by the EPA to remind you. So folks often don't really hear about this as much. I think a TRI is a lot more out reminding you, and certainly if you've done them before, you're getting reminders. The actual report is required by Section 8A of the Toxic Substances Control Law. So what's in a chemical data report? What's in the CDR? Well, for the current cycle, the 2020 CDR, the report obviously will contain, and it does contain, production volume. So how much of this chemical is being manufactured or imported for the 4-year reporting cycle. Again, this is a 2016, 17, 18, and 19 report cycle. Those are the 4 calendar years. There is some additional information. I will identify it as TRI-like information about manufacturing, processing, and use for the 2019 calendar year. So that information is not specifically required for the earlier years in the report. We need volumes for those years. I'll mention the threshold a few times during the presentation, but the threshold, the most important threshold, is the 25,000 pound production volume, PV, as it says, if you read online, this is PV, production volume, threshold of 25,000 pounds in any one of the reporting years. So if you're triggering in any one of the reporting years, you're in this. There are quite a few chemicals which have a reduced reporting threshold of 2,500 pounds. And those are chemicals for which certain TSCA actions apply. And I'm going to show you how to determine whether your chemical falls into that. So that's quite a smaller threshold, obviously. And these are for chemicals, again, that are on the list, on the TSCA inventory, on the current list as of June 1, 2020. The report is and does have some similarities with the TRI, especially I say the process of the report. The chemical data report uses the EPA Central Data Exchange, the CDX. And again, I'm not going to give a blow-by-blow description of doing that, but it obviously means you need to have a password, a login, etc. And that all has to be done ahead of time. The report itself is called a Form U. So that's the name of the report, Form U report. Each site needs to create a separate Form U, and you can have multiple chemicals on a single Form U. This report is done using a specific reporting tool which is part of that package, the CDX package. So the CSPP, what I have on the bottom of the screen, Submissions for Chemical Safety and Pesticide Programs, that is the part of the package that you need to access and put within your CDX. So Try Me Web, as an example, is one of them, the data elements, one of the programs that runs on the CDX. But in this case, you're going to have to load the CSPP program in order to submit or create a Form U. And of course, the Form U is submitted electronically. It's not a paper submit. This is a screenshot, and I wanted to share it. This is what happens and what you see when you go onto the EPA.gov/chemical data reporting, and it says obviously right there that the reporting submission period is now open, and you have until November 30th. That date was recently extended, so you have until November 30th. So this is not something that you need to be concerned with if you're in the middle of TRI reporting. And I want to put a plug out for the EPA site. It's actually well done and organized. I called the TSCA helpline several times. They're generally pretty good. And the links that you see on the page are generally pretty good. So how to report, who needs to report, etc. how to access the CDR web. I think in general it's pretty good. What's changed for 2020, and so for folks who are going to really get into CDR reporting, certainly you'll be in this page. Several things have changed for the 2020 cycle, and again, because this is a report that only takes place every 4 years, folks maybe are not expert or are not really so tuned in to changes because they weren't familiar with it even before the changes. So as I've already stated, it's a 4-year cycle. This is the year covering 2016 to 19. To give you a feel for the number of reports, less than 6,000 sites reported in 2016. I mean, that is a really tiny subset of PRI reporting. And that last report was done with the 2016 report, which was the look back period of 12 to 15. I believe that 2020 should have more reports filed. I think that the reporting universe is subject to increase because of global supply chain practices, and I'm going to talk about importing and talk about several things. But that's my belief. I think we're going to see more reports for the 2020 cycle. And there's been several new rules which were finalized very recently in March, obviously to be incorporated into the current 2020 cycle. I'll talk about those. There's been some changes to the 2020 cycle. There, I love when they publish that it's reducing regulatory burden, but that's always one of the sort of advertisements regarding changes. Byproducts, that's probably a more significant one. Mostly in general, byproducts are exempt, and they've now added some exemptions for byproducts that are manufactured in non-integral equipment, such as pollution control or boilers. I'm going to talk more about byproducts. The co-manufacturing, that's the use of a contracting company versus a producing company. There's been some changes in that area for folks who are involved with that. That's something that they're going to want to pay attention to. So, as I've previously stated, this is a 4-year report, and this is for folks who are manufacturing chemicals. We're going to talk more about that, or importing. Reporting period has started. It's on the EPA website. You have till the end of November, so you have plenty of time. The 25,000, 2,500 threshold, and for those chemicals which are on the inventory. So some of the things I've already mentioned. And it's, again, TRI-like data, annual production volume, and using the EPA CDX portal. I'm going to, for a slide, hand over to Tiffany Thomas and just talk to you a little bit about this next slide. Appreciate it, Tiffany.
Thanks, Adam. So what I wanted to impress upon everybody was that we tend to get a little bit complacent when it comes to our chemical inventory and chemical usage. And really what that boils down to is just because it's a common chemical that we use in a lot of processes doesn't necessarily equate to any level of safety. And that chemical may still be included in the TSCA inventory. So as Adam mentioned earlier, there's over 40,000 active chemicals in this list, and that does include many common industrial products and solvents. So things even as simple as formaldehyde, which, I mean, obviously everybody is familiar with, but it's an old solvent. It's not like it's something new that hasn't been around for a while, but even formaldehyde was just recently added as a chemical that needs to be included in an inventory. So what I'm trying to emphasize is that a regular inventory management strategy needs to be implemented to make sure that you're screening your current suppliers, that if your suppliers change, you need to reconfirm your sourcing. Basically make that be kind of an annual refresher what's being purchased and confirm it against the TSCA list, because specifically things may have been added. And granted, that doesn't happen on a monthly basis, but it's definitely something that should not be taken for granted. So things like 1,2-dichlorobenzene was just added. I mean, things that are not crazy esoteric compounds. So just remember that even common things that are used in a number of industrial processes may be new to the inventory, and just don't take those kinds of assumptions for granted that you've never had to report it before, and it's not something that you need to worry about now. To that end, I'll go ahead and toss it back over to Adam. I just wanted to, bring that up, that's something that tends to be complacency is a particularly challenging hurdle to overcome when it comes to safety. So, all right, Adam, back to you.
Thank you very much, Tiffany. Okay, so I think this is always the the magic question, right? So I'm hearing something about this Form U. I'm hearing something about chemical data reporting. Do I need to file a report? And I think it always seems interesting to me that a lot of the tools that they provide are sort of like how to help you make the filing. I think sometimes it's less of a flavor of, does this apply to me? You have to sort of dig a little bit more for that. And one of the things I wanted to share, which I think is very simple, but at the same time powerful, is the concept of get out in your facility and really take a look at the process and take a look at your product. And this is really going to be one of the first steps in understanding, is this a regulation or report that's applicable to you? Certainly you could do a more formal audit under TSCA, formally audit and document whether TSCA is applicable. But to just keep it somewhat simple, are you manufacturing a chemical which is a commercial product? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what is a chemical for a commercial product. But, are you manufacturing chemicals? Okay? Are you literally a facility that's manufacturing chemicals which you sell? Okay? And are these chemicals or products liquids, gases, powders, particles, or do they look like airplane wings? Because an airplane wing is an article and it's not a chemical. So, what is the form of these products? Another really big one is, are you using chemical ingredients which are not manufactured in the United States? This is pretty simple. I mean, go out in your manufacturing space and look at the containers of chemicals, the bags, the boxes, totes, super sacks, drums. Where are these chemicals manufactured? Are they manufactured in Mexico? Are they manufactured in Canada? Are they manufactured in the EU? Are they manufactured in India? In today's world, a lot of chemical ingredients are not manufactured in the United States. So that's something that could be a potential flag that gets you into the need to file a Form U report. How about this simple one? Has the site ever filed a Form U in the past? Did they file one last cycle in 2016? Obviously, if they did, let's look at it. Did they need to file at that time? I'm assuming they did. Did they need to file this time again? The assumption or initial assumption might be they do. Speak to your purchasing department. They know where they're getting chemicals. And again, you're leaning in the direction of imported material. So is the purchasing department getting materials, chemicals from a non-U.S. source supplier? And if so, if you are seeing these chemicals on the shop floor, purchasing says, yes, we use lots of non-U.S. source chemicals, are you the importer? And again, I'm going to get more into the discussion of are you the importer, but do you think you're the importer? And if not, who might be? So there's a good fact sheet on this, and I'm going to share that fact sheet at the end of the program. But I just wanted to share what I think is just some really kind of basic questions to put in your head to start to think about: is this a program that applies to me? There's other things about being a small manufacturer. There's several ways you can get out of this too. We're going to get into some of those exceptions. Okay, so what does it mean to manufacture? What does it mean to manufacture a chemical? Just like with TRI, they have a manufacture option. You are manufacturing the chemical. In the case of TSCA CDR, always think of manufacture and import as the same. So did you import and or manufacture the chemical for a commercial purpose? Did you create a new compound via chemical reaction? Obviously, that's manufacturing the chemical. It was an actual chemical reaction. You didn't just change its shape or form. Did you produce the chemical for a commercial purpose? Meaning, did you isolate the chemical? Did it truly end up being a product? And we're going to talk about byproducts, which are not necessarily isolated nor produced for commercial purposes and can be exempt from reporting. And again, is this chemical that's being produced being sent into commerce where the public could be exposed? Or are you just, well, an example, are you just a blender? I'm going to step up one more time on this. I do apologize for this light, but I think it's better with the light. When the light comes on in my office. So are you just a blender, for example? So there's no chemical reaction, and you're just blending a few chemicals. In that case, you may not be manufacturing anything. And again, as I've already mentioned, are the ingredients you're using imported? So the other thing to look at is the chemical itself subject to TSCA? Is it subject to the CDR reporting process? And again, remember your general exemptions, meaning that this chemical was manufactured or imported for a non-TSCA use and therefore not required to be reported. Foods, cosmetics, pesticides, nuclear materials, I see pesticides mentioned twice, tobacco, firearms, not required to be reported. Polymers are generally completely exempt, as are naturally occurring substances generally exempt. So quite a few petroleum process streams are exempt, and there's lists of these. Certain impurities are exempt. Natural gas, obviously, would fall into that naturally occurring or petroleum process. Research and development exemptions. So there are exemptions, and an obvious one is, is it listed on the inventory itself? And you're going to obviously have to check that. So if it's not on the inventory, it's obviously exempt from reporting. This is a pretty big one, and I think it is one that is, well, there's an informational document that I'm going to provide, that fact sheet at the bottom at the end of the presentation. But articles are exempt, and let's talk about what's an article. So, as is similar with the definitions that are used for PRI reporting, an article retains its shape as part of its function. Okay, so for instance, the second bullet example is if I'm buying billets of alloys or containers of plastic beads that I'm melting, these are simply in a shape that is convenient for transportation to the facility. The alloy billet is in a shape that is reasonable in size and weight. These are not articles. They're not finished products. The shape is not part of its function. For instance, a welding rod is not an article. because it's designed to be melted. Things like wires, sheets, batteries, film, plywood, some rolled materials. Certain changes can actually be okay and retain the article exemption. I think one thing to think about is the fluids or particles. This is a fairly simple one. So per the federal definition, an item which exists solely in a fluid, including a liquid, gas, it does not have a definitive shape, and it therefore doesn't meet the elements of the definition of an article under 40 CFR 704.3. There's even discussion of whether the article contains a chemical that is not intended to be released. And they gave an interesting example where brake fluid that was part of the car being imported, but is integral to the car, not intended to be released, can qualify for an article exemption. However, if I import the same brake fluid in a 55-gallon drum, and obviously that's a container, it is not in an article, that is not exempt. So that was sort of interesting. So the same material would not be exempt. They gave an additional example of high-density polyethylene, scraps and pieces being melted, not an article, but it also, if that's maybe a trick one, because it's a polymer, it's exempt from CDR reporting. They actually mentioned that certain facilities that would import sheets of steel or and bend them and weld them, that's okay. That depending on how that's being done, but so it's not so strict. I mean, you could change the form a little bit, provided there's no change in chemical composition. So I think this is one that really is worth looking at and thinking about if you're starting to get into the discussion of are we truly importing a chemical or are we importing an article? And again, the fact sheet's pretty good on this too, as well as the reporting instructions. And I think the pen and the ink one was kind of interesting, that the ink is designed to be removed from the article. Another one is the byproduct exemption. And I think there's quite a bit on this that's worth looking at. So let's look at sort of a definition of the word. Chemical substance produced without separate commercial intent during the manufacture, processing, use, or disposal with another chemical substance or mixture. It may or may not have commercial value. And as I mentioned, one of the new carve-outs is that if I'm generating the byproduct in a pollution control device or boiler, not required to be reported. I thought an interesting one was sodium nitrate. And the reason I thought that is, as a lot of folks know, they are doing their TRI reporting at facilities that are generating, or I should say, neutralizing nitric acid, are generating soluble sodium nitrate, and those nitrates are reportable because they're discharged to the POTW or typically sometimes directly to a surface body, and they don't get treated, and so they're reportable. You're manufacturing nitrate. But for the purposes of CDR reporting, although you might trigger 25,000 pounds of you may trigger the reporting threshold of 25,000 pounds of production volume of this chemical, because the byproduct is not being isolated and it is not being done with the intent of your process, it is not reportable. So there's an example where that byproduct, although clearly being manufactured, is not reportable under the CDR. It's a byproduct and it is exempt. It is not being produced for commercial intent, not being separated, isolated. I'll say that if your facility was actually manufacturing sodium nitrate, meaning isolating it, turning it possibly into a powder, selling it as a product, there's an example where the same sodium nitrate would be reportable. So it's worth thinking about some of these things. And this shows you some differences between CDR and TRI reporting and the instructions for the 2020 cycle. The EPA instructions talk about this on page 16. So, did I manufacture? Did I import? Did I exceed a reporting threshold? Again, I only have to exceed the reporting threshold for one of the subject years. 25,000 pounds. Some have 2,500 pounds. We're going to show you how to find that out. Check each calendar year. 1 year triggers, reports required. Look for mixtures. Check components of a mixture. Obviously, you check safety data sheets. Are you part of the possible exemptions? Is this an article? Is this a byproduct? We've already discussed some of these exemptions. Do you think you're the importer? You may be, you may not be. Are you a small manufacturer? This has been carved out now in the regulation. So for 2019 sales, less than, if you have less than 12 million in sales, then you're considered out, and it doesn't matter your production volume. Or if your total sales are less than $120 million, but the production volume has to be less than 100,000 pounds in that case. So there could be some situations where you opt out either way, depending on what the production volume is and or depending on what your total sales are for 2019. Again, this is who's an importer. This is one that you're going to see. There's several papers, and in fact, there's an imported articles document that's pretty good. So I think this is confusing, so let's just sort of go through a few of these. The person who imports the chemical article into the United States. Okay, that sounds basic. The person who's paying customs duty. An authorized agent from the buyer who's authorized to be importing. The importer of record. I think in many cases, you're buying potentially of a material that's already in the United States. So for instance, we already discussed getting out on the shop floor and looking at the chemicals and seeing if they're non-US sourced, but did you truly import it, or did you already buy it from a facility that already had brought it into the United States? So at the time of purchase, it was already in the United States, and you certainly didn't import it, and somebody else, a layer removed from you, imported it. This is the, one of my examples of, you buy the bottle of French wine in the package store, and clearly it's French wine, not made in the United States, but you didn't import it, nor did the store you bought it from import it. It had been imported by somebody else. At the end of the day, it's important to sift through this, because someone is going to be responsible potentially for these TSCA CDR obligations. And this is potentially one where it's worth reaching out, and you may have to talk to purchasing, you may have to talk to your supplier, and you may have to sort of feel your way through this to determine if you're the importer or somebody else is the importer under TSCA. One of the ones I know that Tiffany's seen and used many times, and I don't know what folks sort of experiences with this, but this is really a great tool. If you've never used the Substance Registry Services, it's really a great tool. You can search by list, you can search by an individual entry, and when you do a search, it's going to tell you exactly which list it's on. It's going to tell you if it's active or inactive. It's going to tell you which orders may apply, and those orders are important because that gets you down to the 2,500 pound production volume threshold versus the 25,000. So this is really an easy to use, very good tool, and a lot better than downloading lists and searching through Excel files and all sorts of other things that I've done and I've seen other people do. And I'm going to share with you a screenshot. So here's the screenshot. Wait a minute. Here's the screenshot of what happens when you go on the, if you actually, you can search by list, as I say, you can search by single entry, and the bottom section there, when you scroll down, there's a TSCA section, and it'll show you all the lists. It'll give you really a good summary of that chemical, and really be a very good tool to use to determine if your chemical even falls into the reporting, and if so, what the thresholds are, et cetera. Is it active, et cetera. So I would say that this is a great place to be starting as you start to read through whether you might need to be reporting for a specific chemical. I think the data itself that's on the Form U is probably somewhat, you could guess, and obvious. So when you actually start to populate a Form U, you're going to report site data, you're going to identify the site, you're going to have obviously who owns the site, name and address, who the technical contacts are. This is nothing different than the PRI report cycle. You're obviously going to be reporting the chemical itself. You're going to be providing the chemical abstract registration number. And again, you've probably done your SRR search. I mean, you're going to have this information. You're going to need to have gathered the volumes within those subject years, as we've discussed. One of the interesting things is the number of workers that can be reasonably exposed. This is one that can be very sensitive and people may be uncomfortable with. But they have range codes for folks that are going to be exposed. Questions about recycle versus waste, percentage that's byproduct, what's the physical form. As I already mentioned, 16 and 18 are only production volume. But it was not my intent this morning to walk through the line by line, blow by blow of the actual filling out the Form U report. Again, did you manufacture the material or did you import it? In this case, they're not treating them exactly the same. You actually could have chemicals that were never physically present on the site being reported. That's where it's being imported directly to your customer, but you're still the one who's going to be filing the CDR because you are the importer of record. So you can see this, industrial sector codes, functional categories, it's folks that, here's one that's interesting. So the use in products intended for children, and they're defining that as for children under the age of 14. So for instance, if you had a toy or a certain type of chemical that was going to be applied to children's clothing, so those are products that they're going to have further focus on, and you're going to have to indicate that, and just, again, how many folks are being exposed. You can also do joint submissions where if two people are responsible for the submission, or even situations where the non-U.S. manufacturer does not want to give you the sufficient level of detail to make the report. There's also confidential business information that can be labeled as confidential. So there's several things that also can take place here, within the report. One Form U per site, one or more chemicals per Form U. already said that again, the website is good. I think the EPA did a nice job with it. The reporting standard, known or reasonably ascertainable by data, so, obviously you needed to do some level of due diligence to make sure that you're putting a reasonable standard for obtaining this data, scratching, under the surface, etc., and making sure that if this report applies to you, then obviously you're filing the report. The actual report process using the CDR web. I'm going to share the slide deck with folks. In fact, we can do that. I think, Leo, I did not send those to you. I'll send you those slide decks. They did a nice job with that, and I did not go through those blow by blow, screenshot by screenshot slides. And it's pretty straight. It's not too bad once you get into it. If you're actually going to generate and file a Form U, just like in TRI, there's the authorized official who has the ability to create, unlock, amend, submit the report. There's an agent who can create, amend, and also submit some of these amended reports, and then there's a new support function who's assigned by the authorized official who can help modify reports. So you have to have all that set up in advance, who's authorized to make the submission, etc., and get yourself completely set up to file these reports. And that all does take some time also. And that's what the screenshot looks like. So when you are on the EPA website, that's what you get. And the webinars that I mentioned and the resources and other things are right there. And they actually even have the transcript, so it's pretty good. And there's, again, on the bottom of the screen, the submission period, and ending on November 30th. And with that, that's really the material I had for this morning. I wanted to allow some time, has been our norm, for Q&As. And Leo, I'd like you to maybe chime in. I haven't looked because I've been presenting here what kind of answers we got from our question. And I hope this was informative. I hope that in general that this was a good use of folks' time this morning, and that you're at least a little more comfortable to ask at least some of the intelligent questions around this reporting process.
Thank you, Adam. Nice job. We did get some responses on your polling question, and approximately 75–80% of people really have no experience filing a CDR report.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. This is a 4-year cycle, and it's the odd duck report, so that makes sense.
We do have one question that's come in.
Okay.
And this question says, my company changed ownership in early 2020. Do we use the name of the company in 2016 through 2019, the covered period, or the name of the company at the beginning of the submission period when filling out the forms?
The so they changed when? One more time?
In early 2020.
For TRI, there's something similar, and we dealt with this for some clients, and I would want to run this to ground before giving a definitive answer, but it would generally be the older name, because the 2020, we're not reporting 2020 data. We're reporting previous year information and several years previous information. So generally, the answer would be that it would be the previous name, not the early 2020 change. But I would want to run that to ground and confirm that with the specifically on the CDR instruction.
Okay, we have her name. We'll reply to her directly via email with a more definitive answer there. Are there any other questions? If not, thank you all very much for attending today. Everybody that actually registered for the class will get a certificate of attendance, and we'll email those out in a few days or so. I am going to send an email here in just a moment that has a link to just a very short, simple 4-question survey if you kindly provide us some feedback. And in that email, we also have some of the attachments that Adam referenced in his presentation. So we have no other questions. Thanks, everybody. And hopefully, we'll see some of you next week when we talk about RCRA hazardous waste regulatory update. Thank you and have a great day.